Good morning. Time for us to get started in our Bible class. We're going to be starting in John chapter 5, if you want to turn your Bibles there. John chapter 5. We are very likely the second year of Jesus' ministry. It mentions in verse 1 of John chapter 5 that he went up to Jerusalem for a feast. And most scholars think that was the Passover. If that's the case, it's the second Passover. And so it would be in the second year of Jesus' ministry. He spent a good deal of time in Galilee, and now he's come back to Jerusalem for a feast. The hostility and the animosity of the Pharisees is growing and growing. Some of them begin following him about everywhere he goes. And so he's continuing having issues with them. And we're going to look at three different events in the life of Christ this morning where he had to deal with the opposition of the Pharisees. In John chapter 5, talks about the fact that in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there was a pool. Now, the sheep gate was one of the gates in the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Most people think it was probably used to bring the animals in to get to the temple for the sacrifice. It says there was a pool. They think that pool was where the animals were washed in order to get them ready for the sacrifice. Now, that's what they think. We don't know that for certain. And it says it had 5 roofed colonnades. It had roofs over that pool. And there were poles or columns that held that roof up. So it was a covered pool. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. It's interesting, in the Bible that I have, some of the older translations, there's a verse 4, where it talks about an angel coming down and trouble, or they thought an angel came down and troubled the water. That's left out of newer translations. It's not in there because there's not enough scholarship evidence to include it in Scripture. Most people think the probability is, you go down to verse 7 and it talks about him talking about nobody to get him in the pool when the water is stirred up. And there are some people who think that verse 3 was added by the copyist to try to explain verse 7. Well, that's the case or not, I don't know. What you have to understand is it talks about an angel stirring up the pool. That's not a fact. That's what the people thought was happening. The probability is that pool was fed by an underground spring. And every time that spring bubbled or bubbled up, then the pool would bubble. And they took that as a sign that an angel was coming down and troubling the water. They thought that their idea was the first person that stepped in the water after it bubbled was automatically healed. Now, that's not the truth. That's what they thought. That's what the Jews accepted. I don't think that's in reality what really happened. But that's what all those people were there for. And these lay multitude of invalids, blind, lame, paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. And had been an invalid for 38 years, there are two possibilities. Number one, he was born that way, and he was 38 years old. The second possibility, and I think the one more likely, we'll get into this a little bit later in the chapter, is at a certain point in his life, he became invalid, and it had been 38 years since that happened. But either one of those is a possibility. Jesus saw him lying there and knew he had been there a long time. He said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" Isn't that an interesting question? How many people do you know who would say no? Of course, Jesus simply asked that question to open up a conversation. That was a conversation starter. You want to be healed? The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, while I'm going down another steps before me." And evidently, this man was not completely paralyzed, but had difficulty in getting around. And so he was slow in being able to get down to where he said, by the time I get there, somebody's already in there. And the second person, it don't matter. It's just the first person. That was what they thought. While I'm going down those steps before me, Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. One of the translations says at once. One of the translations says immediately. One of the things you will notice about the miracles of Christ is they're instantaneous. When he spoke the word, they happened. There wasn't any waiting. There wasn't any, got to do this again. It was instantaneous. It was immediate. The man took up his bed and walked. Now, here's where the problem starts. Now, that day was the Sabbath. If you know the Pharisees, you know what happened next. The Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to take up your bed." And I want to stop here for just a couple moments because that was not true. The Old Testament did not say he could not carry his mat. We're talking about a big bed. We're talking about a mat that he laid on while he was around that pool. The Old Testament did not say that. The Old Testament said you were not supposed to work on the Sabbath day. Even the Jews did, and we're going to talk about that some as we move through this idea. 10 Commandments, right? Exodus 20. By the first century, the Jews had written 613 commandments to explain those 10. 248 of them were positive. 365 of them were negative. Now, the interesting thing, I found this very interesting. If he had still been invalid and somebody was carrying that mat with him on it, that was fine. You could do that on the Sabbath day, but you couldn't carry an empty mat. You could carry a mat with a person on it, but you couldn't carry an empty mat because carrying a mat with a person on it was considered being kind, getting somebody work. Carrying a mat by itself was considered work. It tells you what kind of nitpicking the Pharisees and the Jews of the first century did. They had a certain distance marked from their house. That was as far as you could walk on the Sabbath day. If you walked any further than that, it was work. The problem that Jesus had with the Pharisees was not their adherence to the law. Jesus taught adherence to the law. Jesus taught obey the law to those people in the first century. What the problem was that the Pharisees had made their opinions and their ideas and their think-sos equal to the law. And they were enforcing it just like they were the law. And we can't do that. In the book of Revelation, John writes that don't add to nor take away from. You can't add to the law. And that's exactly, well, remember the Sabbath day is too complicated. Let's explain it. What happens when men start explaining the law of God and start adding to it? Opinions and division. Every human creed that has ever been written had been written with the intent of producing unity. We need to write down explicitly what we believe so that we'll know what we believe and everybody who's a part of us will know what we believe. The problem with that is if you and I have a different opinion and we put that in the realm of opinion, we can get along just fine. If I write that down and make it a law, I can no longer fellowship you because you've broken the law. Not God's law, my law. And so the Pharisees were so nitpicky about little bitty things. And Jesus told them they forgot about justice and mercy and faith. That was the issue that Jesus had with the Pharisees. It was not that they were fastidious about keeping the law. Jesus said, don't remove one jot or one tittle. Anybody know what a jot and tittle is? It's a crossing. It's similar to the dotting of a T and the crossing of an I. Or the dotting of an I and the crossing of a T. I did that backwards. The dotting of an I and the crossing of a T. That's what a jot and a tittle are. They were marks in the Hebrew language. Not one jot or one tittle. Don't change it at all. When he talked to the Pharisees about them, when he talked about tithing small things, he did not say don't tithe those small things. He said do the justice and mercy and the faith and tithe the small things. So that was the issue. Once the man was healed, he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath, so the Jews, the word Jews here is probably in reference to the religious leaders of the Jews. They were trying to enforce their own laws. Said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed. Now, this guy does the I'm going to sidestep this one. Because he basically says it's not my fault. He answered him, the man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk. That other guy told me. I didn't do this on my own, not my fault, somebody else's fault. He doesn't want to be in trouble with the Pharisees. Nobody wanted to be in trouble. Nobody wanted to be in trouble with the religious leaders. Because the power they had, they could excommunicate you in about 5 seconds. And unfortunately, that's the reason most of the Jews wouldn't stand up to them. He answered him, the man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk. They asked him, who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk? This gives you an indication of how much interaction Jesus and this man had. Because they said, who was it? And Jesus said, or the man answered, said, I don't know. I don't know who he was. You know, generally when you meet somebody, the first thing you do is tell them your name. There was hardly any interaction. Jesus walked out to the man and said, you want to be healed? The man said, yeah. And he said, get up and walk. And he got started walking and Jesus left. The man who had been healed did not know who it was, so Jesus had withdrawn as there was a crowd in the place. And afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you are well, sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. Now read that verse. What idea do you get out of it? His illness or whatever it was a consequence of some sin. He had done something, violated the law in some way, and the result of that, he ended up being an invalid. Now, whether it was in the actions he was taking, he actually hurt himself, or whether it was a direct punishment from, I don't know. Now, if you go out and get drunk and you drive a car and you run into a tree and you hurt yourself because of sin. God didn't do that to you. You did it to yourself. And that may very well be what happened here. This man had done something. In the doing of that, he had hurt himself. And Jesus said, don't sin anymore so that nothing worse happens to you. In other words, you keep doing this and something worse than being an invalid may happen to you. But watch out. The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. Now, there are a lot of people who read this passage who want to give some kind of horrible motive to this man. Well, he went and told the Pharisees because he wanted to rat on Jesus. That didn't have anything to do with it. Don't assign evil motives to somebody without some kind of evidence. I don't know why he went and told the Jews because Scripture doesn't say. He may very well have just answered their question. Asked me a question, I know the answer. I found out the answer, I'm going to go tell them. May have been that simple, I don't know. Told him it was Jesus, and this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing things on the Sabbath day. Jesus answered them, my Father is working until now, and I am working. Now remember my Father is working, and I am working. Now read the next verse. This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Now, those people who tell you Christ never claimed to be God didn't read that verse, because that's what the Jews understood. The Jews said he called God his Father. That means he's claiming to be God. And notice it says they were opposing him because he was breaking the Sabbath. He was not breaking the Sabbath. What that man did was not a violation of the Sabbath. is a violation of their interpretation of the Sabbath, which are totally and completely two different things. If it had been a sin for that man to carry his bed on Sabbath, Christ wouldn't tell him to do it. But that wasn't really what they were complaining about. We're going to see that in just a couple. They were complaining about the fact they healed somebody. And healing somebody is work. You can't work on Sabbath day. It's ridiculous. Yeah, he did not. And he didn't tell somebody else to do it either. Anyone else have a question or comment before we? Notice he mentions God is working and my work is consistent with my Father. And so keep that in mind. Anyone else have a question or comment?
It was on that same day that they asked the man who told you to repent. Is it the persecution of Jesus that's generally their job is to enforce all these commandments?
That's what they thought. Well, under their interpretation of work, probably.
I was curious because
They are, and we're going to see this. The next two events we're going to go through, you're going to see this. The Pharisees were very hypocritical. Enforcing one thing and not enforcing another. Accepting one thing and not accepting another.
That's the message I got from here.
Yeah.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the things Jesus told them in Matthew 23. He said, you bind burdens on other people and you won't lift a finger to pick them up yourself. Their standard for other people is different than their standard for themselves. When you think of the word hypocrite, think of the word actor. Because that's what hypocrite is. In fact, that's what the word was used for in the first century. Actors in plays wore masks so that they could look like somebody else. The hypocrite, technically, was a person who wore a mask. When Jesus called the Pharisees hypocrites, you say you're wearing a mask. You're pretending to be something that you are not. Anyone else question or comment? Turn to Mark chapter 2. In Mark chapter 2, and through the end of the chapter, Mark chapter 3, first part, we're going to talk about two more events that occurred on the Sabbath. I don't know if these are the same Sabbath or not. I doubt it, but I can't prove that one way or the other. Verse 23 of Mark chapter 2, one Sabbath he was going through the grain fields. As they made their way, his disciples began to put heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, look, what are they doing? Why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Now again, they're accusing Jesus' disciples of violating the Sabbath. What Jesus' disciples did not violate the Sabbath. All they did was eat. They walked through a grain field, they were plucking grain, they were putting it in their hand, they're rubbing it together, separate the husk from the grain, throwing the husk away and eating them. Now the Pharisees had gotten so technical that pulling that grain was considered harvesting, rubbing it in your hands was considered threshing, and throwing the husk away was considered reaping. So according to them, the disciples broke three laws because they harvested, they threshed, and they reaped on the same day. Pardon my English, but that's a bunch of baloney. The other thing some people say is, well, they were walking through a field and they were eating somebody else's grain, so they were stealing. No. Back in the book of Exodus and Numbers, and I think also in Deuteronomy, there's a specific law called the law of gleaning, where they were to leave certain parts of their field for the poor and the hungry. It was biblical. It was right for the Pharisees, for the disciples to be eating that food. Now again, the major accusation being made here is they were working on the Sabbath day. Jesus said, have you never read what David did when he was in need and he was hungry, and he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. Now, oftentimes when you hear this voice, what people will say is, David violated the law, and God allowed it. The disciples violated the law, and God allowed it. He's making a comparison. That's not the point. The point is not that one person violated the law, so it's okay for the other person to violate. The point is the Pharisees approved of what David did. David blatantly violated the law of Moses when he went to the tabernacle and ate the showbread that only the priests are supposed to eat. That's wrong. They approved of that. They disapproved of the disciples doing something that was lawful. What Jesus is actually doing is telling them, you're a hypocrite. You're enforcing this, but you're not enforcing this. They would not accuse David of hardly anything. I'm sure they probably tried to come up with an excuse to do away with his adultery and murder. They thought David was their hero. And if he did it, it must have been right. No, it wasn't right. Well, he was saying to the Pharisees is, you're not recognizing, you're not thinking about what you're saying. Now notice he went on to say, let me get my pages are stuck together. Verse 28, Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. I'm in charge here. I am the Son of Man. I am the Son of God. I wrote the law. So if I want to, I can change it. Now the fact of the matter is he didn't. He lived by it. He lived according to it, but he had that power. And that's one of the things that kept upsetting the Pharisees and the leaders of the Jews. Christ putting himself on an equal footing with God. And to them, that was blasphemy. And if he had not been God, it would have been blasphemy. If he said, I am the Son of God, and he's not, that's blasphemy. But he said, I am the Son of God, and he is. Well, it's not blasphemy. And so again, the Pharisees are really, what they're doing is they're looking for the minutest little detail that they can trap Jesus on. They're not listening to what he says. They're not watching anything that he does. They're not paying attention to anything except, how can I catch him? I'm looking for something I can accuse him of. Now notice, when the man with the withered hand was healed, back in chapter 5, or the man with the invalid was healed, they went right past that part. He didn't talk about him being healed. He didn't talk about a man who was an invalid now being able to walk, and not only walk, but carry his own bed. They went straight to, well, you did that on the Sabbath day. And so they're looking right past the evidence because they're not looking for it. It's a very important message, I think, for you and I today. We need to read the Scriptures with an open mind. I don't decide what I believe. I then go read the Bible to prove what I believe. I read the Bible and accept what it says, and that's what I believe. If I've already got my mind made up what the truth is, then what am I reading for? What am I doing? You don't confuse me with the facts. My mind's already made up. No. And if you don't change your view of some things in Scripture over time, you're not studying very much. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Question or comment? Chapter 3. Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. They watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. Notice that. That's their motive. Some have even suggested they may have brought this man with withered hand in there for that very purpose. They're trying to trap Jesus. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, it is lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill. They were silent. They couldn't answer him. He looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out, and they immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. There's one of the parallel passages to this in Mark 3. I can't remember whether it's in Matthew or Luke. But Jesus actually make the comment, if your sheep fell in a ditch on Saturday, on Sabbath day, would you go get it out? Of course they would. It's okay to do good to a sheep. It's horrible to heal a man who's got a withered hand. Does that seem a little contradictory to you? Although with some of our modern day animal rights movements, they may not think so. You'll help a sheep. You'll go get your own sheep. But I can't heal a man with a withered hand. Now, part of that may have been that was his sheep. That was not his withered hand. That may have been part of their motivation behind it. But they were not watching Jesus to learn. They were not watching Jesus to get information. They were watching Jesus to trap him. Their intent, their idea was, we are going to kill this guy. Now we got to figure out how. He's going to be dead. Now we got to figure out which law he violated. They've already passed sentence. You know, it's kind of like the judge walking into a courtroom before trial ever starts and says, this guy's going to be executed. Now we got to figure out what to charge him with. That's how the Pharisees acted. In fact, that's even how the trial of Jesus was in Matthew 26. We know he's guilty. We know he's going to die. Now we got to figure out what he's guilty of, which is completely backwards of the way things are supposed to work. Jesus looked at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. David Banks mentioned Thursday night in his lesson about being stubborn, bullheaded. They'd already decided what the truth was. They were hard-hearted. The word hard-hearted there gives you the idea not only of being stubborn, but of having no emotions in the heart. When they saw this man with a withered hand, they didn't think about his condition. They didn't think about having compassion on him because he was less fortunate. They thought about, I got a way to trap Jesus now. And so they were not only closed-minded, they were closed-hearted. They had no compassion, no concern, no mercy for anybody except themselves. They had become so nitpicky. One of the things that happens when you get to focusing on minute things, you get so devoted to those things and you get so hard on those things that you forget about the bigger picture. Now, our world today is doing the exact opposite. We have become so focused on mercy and compassion and kindness that we've forgotten about the commandments of the law. Generally, that's what man does. We focus on one or the other. We focus on mercy and love, or we focus on commandments. The fact of the matter is the truth's in the middle. You got to have both. You got to have commands and mercy. What mercy does is it takes up when you fall short of the commandments. It doesn't mean you don't have to try. It doesn't mean you don't obey the commandments. It doesn't mean you don't have to live right. It means where you fall short, and you're going to fall short. Scripture guarantees that. You're going to fall short. And where you fall short, mercy takes up the slack. But mercy doesn't take up the slack when you don't even try. And so that's kind of the focus on the Pharisees was on, we've got this list. and I got all these check marks. And if I do all of these things I'm supposed to do, then I'm going to go to heaven because of me. I'm good enough. I'm righteous enough because I did all these things. About 2,000 years or 3,000 years. Same kind of attitude. Pharaoh had already made up his mind. Nothing Moses did or said or God was going to change his mind. He'd already decided what the truth was. Pharisees was the same way. The only difference was Pharaoh didn't believe in God and the Pharisees supposedly did. Notice I said supposedly. There's one other statement in these verses I wanted to look at. Look at verse 6 in Mark 3. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Who were the Herodians? They were the Jews who supported the Roman government. Herod was an appointee of the Roman government. He was tetrarch because the Romans appointed him tetrarch. What did the Pharisees think about the Romans? They hated them. We want to get rid of the Romans. We want to be a free nation, and we're God's people. We don't deserve to be under the rulership of anybody. Now, the Herodians should have been, and in fact, in most cases were, their mortal enemies. And yet, in this case, they're working together. Why? Common enemy. Jesus. What they thought was, what the Jewish nation thought, that the Messiah was coming to establish a throne and be a king and be a military conqueror. If Jesus had done that, the Herodians would have lost their position because Rome wouldn't have had any power in Judea anymore. There would have not been a Herod the Tetrarch. There would have been Christ the King. And the Pharisees would have lost their position because Jesus was teaching things that was totally opposed to everything they said. If you had gone back from where the Pharisees were, which is what they believed when the Messiah comes, he's going to enforce the old law. If Jesus had enforced the old law as it was written, the Pharisees would have been out of power on their rear end. So the Pharisees were threatened by Jesus. Incorrect interpretation of what Jesus was supposed to be, but they were threatened. The Herodians were threatened by Jesus. So what did they do? Is they worked together. And thirdly, you can throw into that later in the life of Christ, you can throw in the Sadducees in there because they did the same thing. Sadducees were the liberals of their day. They didn't believe in life after death or miracles or angels or any of that stuff. And so them and the Pharisees were, again, in Judea, they were enemies of each other. When it came time to get Christ, they united because they had a common threat. Under any other circumstances, any other situation, you would have not found Pharisees and Herodians even talking to one another. So the idea that Jesus was crucified, year and a half of this, and all that came up in the last week, is a bunch of baloney. The Pharisees have been working on this for at least a couple of years. Now, the way it happened and when it happened was God. And we'll talk about that later when we get into the study of his crucifixion. But the Pharisees had been trying to get Jesus killed for several years. This didn't start the week before Jesus was crucified. This started 2 years before. And it built, 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 and it built. And that's one of the reasons why the majority of Jesus' time on the earth was not spent in Jerusalem. The majority of his time in public ministry was in Galilee. He could have an impact and stay away from the Pharisees. It wasn't he was afraid of them. He could have knocked them dead in 2 seconds. God had a plan. And that plan called for Jesus to die at a specific time in a specific place. And whatever Jesus had to do in order to keep that from happening early, that's what he did. And that's why he went to Galilee. So that that confrontation would not occur before it needed to occur. Anyone have a question or comment? Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Luke 6 and verse 11, which is the end of what we were just talking about, the Bible says the Pharisees were trying to figure out what they might do with Jesus. Mark 12 and verse 14, they took counsel together how they might destroy him. Or Mark 3 and verse 6. John 5 and verse 18, they were seeking all the more to kill him. They already knew what they were going to do. Now they got to figure out a method to get it done. And one of the things that stood in their way was the Romans. Because they couldn't execute anybody without Roman authority. They only got to convince the Jewish nation. They got to convince somebody in the Roman government to give them that permission. Anyone have a question or comment on anything we've talked about this morning? I am done.